In the vast silent expanse of the West, most folks kept their accounts in their heads, a tally of favours owed and grudges held, tallied against the unforgiving arithmetic of survival. But Elspeth Finch was a woman of ink and paper. In a small dust-caked cabin at the edge of the known world, she kept a ledger. It was not a book of dollars and cents, but of debts far heavier, a debt of silence, a debt of mercy, and the one great looming debt she had come to this desolate place to repay. The cabin stood alone, a stubborn knuckle of wood and sod against a landscape that sought to grind everything flat. The wind was its constant companion, a mournful voice that whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Elspeth had lived with that voice for 20 years. It had become the soundtrack to her solitude, the rhythm of her days. She was in her early 60s, a woman carved from the very prairie she inhabited. Her face was a map of sun and sorrow, her hands calloused, but her movements deliberate, imbued with a quiet grace that defied the harshness of her world. Each evening as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the plains in strokes of bruised purple and dying orange, Elspeth would light a single tallow lamp. The flickering light would push back the immense pressing darkness of the prairie night. She would open the calfskin ledger on her small rough-hewn table. Its pages were filled with a spidery elegant script, a stark contrast to the rough world outside. The entries were not transactions, but memories distilled to their essential truths. June 1868. A kindness. Received from the child Mary a single wild prairie rose. Debt gratitude. Paid by mending her doll. Or October 1872. A cruelty. Witness Jedediah Stone whip his horse near to death. Debt. A coward's silence. Unpaid. The ledger was her conscience, her confessor, the unblinking eye of her own personal God. But for all its entries, one page remained stubbornly, terrifyingly blank. The final page. It was for this entry that she had exiled herself. For this entry, she had traded a life for an existence. She was waiting for the final piece of the story to arrive so she could write the ending and finally close the book. She did not know when or how it would come, only that it must. The prairie had taught her patience. The land held its secrets for seasons, for lifetimes. So she would hold hers. The change came, as it always does in the West, with the suddenness of a thunderstorm. It was a Tuesday. The sky was a searing, indifferent blue. Elspeth was tending her small garden, a defiant patch of green, in a world of brown when she saw it. A plume of dust on the horizon. It was not the lazy drift of a passing rider. This was urgent, desperate. She straightened up her hand, shielding her eyes, her body tensing with an instinct she had not needed to call upon in years. The rider was slumped low over his horse, a dark stain spreading across the back of his shirt. The horse, a fine-looking sorrel, was running on pure panic, its sides heaving. As they grew closer, she could see the rider was just a boy, barely a man, his face pale as bleached bone. He collapsed from the saddle not 20 yards from her cabin, falling into the dust with a soft final thud. The horse, its duty done, stood trembling, its great dark eyes fixed on Elspeth. For a long moment she did not move. This was it, the arrival. The world demanded a response. To help was to invite trouble, to invite the past she had so meticulously outrun. To refuse was to add another entry to the ledger under the heading of cruelty, a debt her soul could no longer afford. The wind swirled the dust around the fallen boy, as if trying to reclaim him for the earth. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 2 decades, Elspeth walked forward. The debt of silence was about to be called due. She knelt beside him. He was younger up close, perhaps 17 or 18, with a mess of dark hair stuck to his brow with sweat and fever. The wound was high on his shoulder, ugly and torn. A bullet wound. Old trouble, but still lethal. With a strength that belied her age, she managed to drag him from the unforgiving sun into the cool, dim interior of her cabin. She laid him on her own narrow cot, the coarse blanket a stark contrast to his pale skin. For 3 days and 3 nights she was no longer a solitary homesteader. She was a nurse, a guardian. She worked with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had seen her share of life and death. She cleaned the wound with boiled water and whiskey, her touch surprisingly gentle. She spooned thin broth between his cracked lips, his fevered rambling whispers filling the small space. He spoke of a chase of a stolen map of a man named Silas, with eyes like chips of flint. He spoke of his father, a man who had been searching for something, a treasure that was not gold or silver, but a kind of justice. Elspeth listened, her face impassive, but inside the gears of memory were grinding rusty and loud. Silas. The name was a key, unlocking a door in her mind she had nailed shut 20 years ago. And the boy's father. In his fever, he mumbled the name. Jacob. A wave of cold washed over Elspeth, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Jacob, the man to whom she owed the greatest debt of all. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. The boy whose name she learned was Caleb awoke with clear eyes. He looked around the strange, sparse cabin at the lines of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, at the single rifle resting on pegs above the door. And he looked at Elspeth sitting in her chair by the dying fire, the ledger resting in her lap. "Where?" he began, his voice a dry rasp. "You're safe," she said. Her voice calm, measured. It was the most she had spoken to another human being in years. "You were shot. You've been here 3 days." He struggled to sit up, a flash of fear in his eyes. "He'll find me, Silas." "He will have to find me first," Elspeth said. And the simple statement carried the unyielding weight of the land itself. Over the next week, as Caleb healed, a strange, unspoken routine developed. She would feed him, tend to his wound, and he would watch her. He saw the way she moved with a purpose that seemed to come from the very core of her. He saw the sadness in her eyes, a deep, ancient well of it. He saw the ledger she wrote in every night, but he did not ask. He was a boy who had been taught that questions were dangerous things. He told her his story in fragments, not all at once. His father Jacob had been a prospector, but he wasn't searching for gold. He was a cartographer, a map maker, who had been hired by a mining company to chart a new territory. He had discovered something he shouldn't have, that the company run by a man named Silas was systematically poisoning the water source of a small independent settlement downstream to drive them off their land. Jacob, a man of quiet principles, had created a second secret map, one that documented the company's illegal dams and chemical runoffs, and he had intended to take it to the territorial authorities. But Silas had found out. The night Jacob was to leave, there was a fire, a terrible, all-consuming fire. Caleb, just a babe then, had been pulled from the flames by his mother, but Jacob had perished, or so everyone believed. Silas had taken over the company, the settlers had been starved out, and the story was buried. Caleb's mother had raised him on the story of his father's righteousness and Silas's evil. Before she died a year ago, she had given him a small locked strongbox. It contained his father's journals and a single cryptic clue that suggested the original incriminating map had not been destroyed. It had been entrusted to someone. For 20 years, Caleb had been searching, driven by a need to reclaim his father's stolen legacy and expose Silas for the monster he was. His search had finally led him to a retired company man who, in a fit of deathbed conscience, had told Caleb that Silas was also hunting for the map to destroy the last piece of evidence. The trail had led Caleb into an ambush. Elspeth listened to all of this without a word, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her knuckles were white, for she knew the part of the story Caleb did not. She was the person to whom Jacob had entrusted the map. She had been the settlement school teacher, a widow quiet and respected. Jacob had been her friend, a fellow soul who preferred books to brawls. The night of the fire he had come to her, his face grim. He had pressed a roll of oilcloth into her hands. "Keep this safe, Elspeth," he had said, his voice urgent. "If anything happens to me, this is the only truth that's left. Don't let Silas find it." Before she could respond, the shouting had begun. The orange glow of the fire was already visible over the rooftops. Panic had erupted. In the chaos, she had seen Silas and his men, not fighting the fire, but containing it, ensuring the surveyor's office burned to the ground. She saw the cold, murderous intent in Silas's eyes. And in that moment, Elspeth had been paralyzed by fear. She clutched the map and she had run, not to the authorities, not to help, but away. She had run from the fire, from the town, from Silas, and from her own cowardice. Her silence had been his victory. She had bought her life at the cost of Jacob's justice. That was the debt, the great unpaid debt that festered on the final page of her ledger. She had hidden the map, the truth, in the hollowed-out base of her rocking chair, the same chair she now sat in, a silent monument to her failure. "Why are you helping me?" Caleb asked one evening, his strength returning. He was looking at her with an unnerving intensity, as if he could see the ghosts that haunted her. Elspeth looked away toward the setting sun. "Some things you do because you have to," she said. It was not an answer, but a confession. The day she knew was coming arrived a week later. The air grew still heavy with a tension that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The birds fell silent. From her window, Elspeth saw him. A lone rider approaching, not with haste, but with the patient predatory slowness of a wolf. Even from a distance, she recognized the shape of him. Silas. He was older, gaunter, but the same shadow of a man. She turned to Caleb, her voice low and steady. "Get in the root cellar. Do not make a sound no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Fear and confusion warred in the boy's eyes, but he saw the iron in her gaze. He nodded, scrambling down into the dark earthen hole beneath the floorboards. Elspeth slid the rug back over the trapdoor, placed the heavy table on top of it, and then went to the wall. She took down the rifle. It was heavy in her hands, a cold, final weight. She checked the load, her movements economical, practiced. She had not fired it in 20 years, but some knowledge once learned never leaves the bones. She sat in her rocking chair, the rifle across her lap, and waited. The only sound was the gentle creak of the wood on the floorboards, a sound that held a universe of secrets. The rider stopped outside, Heavy footsteps approached the door, a sharp, commanding knock. Elspeth did not answer. The knob turned and the door swung open. Silas stood there, silhouetted against the harsh light. His eyes, those same flinty chips she remembered, swept the cabin, taking in every detail. They were the eyes of a man who owned the world and was perpetually disappointed by it. He smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his desiccated face. "Elspeth! I'll be damned!" He rasped his voice like grinding stones. "I heard a rumour a ghost was living out here. I see it's true. You've aged." "So have you, Silas," she said, her voice even. "The grave is calling for you." His eyes narrowed, flicking to the rifle in her lap. "Always the poet. I'm not here for you, old woman. I'm here for what the boy has. I tracked him here. Give him to me and I'll let you return to your haunting." "There's no boy here," she said, the lie flat and solid as a stone. Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Don't play games. I know he's here. I can smell the fear. He has something that belongs to me. A story he's been telling. He's been telling the truth." Elspeth said, her grip tightening on the rifle. "A truth you buried in fire." For the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed Silas's face. He took a step into the cabin. "So, you do remember. I always wondered what happened to Jacob's little school teacher. Ran like a frightened rabbit. With the map, I presume." "The map is gone," she said. "Liar," he hissed, taking another step. He was close now, the stale scent of whiskey and malice clinging to him. "Everything Jacob had is mine, by right of conquest. That land, that water, it made me a rich man. I will not have some whelp and some bitter old woman unravel it all with a piece of paper." He lunged not for her, but for the table, guessing, knowing. He meant to throw it aside to reveal the cellar door. He was faster than an old man should be, but Elspeth was ready. She had been ready for 20 years. She did not raise the rifle to her shoulder. There was no time. She simply lifted it, aimed from the hip, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the tiny cabin. It was a sound of finality, a sound that ripped through 2 decades of silence and regret. Silas was thrown backward, a look of profound, almost comical surprise on his face. He collapsed in the doorway, half in the cabin, half out in the unforgiving sunlight. A dark stain bloomed on his chest, and then there was only silence. A profound, ringing silence that was deeper than any that had come before. Elspeth did not move for a long time. She sat in the rocking chair, the rifle still hot across her lap, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. The creaking of the chair was the only sound. Creak, creak. A sound of memory. A sound of truth. Slowly, shakily, she stood. She did not look at Silas. She walked to the table, pushed it aside, and lifted the trap door. Caleb climbed out, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terrible understanding. He looked at the body in the doorway, and then at Elspeth, this quiet, unassuming old woman who had just committed an act of final, brutal justice. She said nothing. She went to her rocking chair, and using a small knife pried at the wooden base. A hidden panel came loose. From within she pulled a long, slender roll of oilcloth, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved. She walked over to Caleb and pressed it into his hands. "This is your father's truth," she said. "I am sorry I kept it for so long." That night, she opened her ledger to the final blank page. The lamp flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. With a steady hand, she dipped her pen in the inkwell. The scratching of the nib was the only sound. August 1888. A cowardice repaid, a silence broken, a truth delivered. Jacob's son is safe. Silas is gone. The debt is paid. She closed the book. The leather cover felt smooth and final beneath her fingers. The next morning, she gave Caleb her best horse, a full canteen, and a bag of provisions. She gave him the map. She did not ask where he would go or what he would do. The truth was his now to carry as he saw fit. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a gratitude and a sorrow too deep for words. "Thank you," he finally managed to say. Elspeth simply nodded. She watched him ride away, a small figure shrinking against the vastness of the plains until he was just another plume of dust on the horizon. But this time, it was a dust of promise, not of panic. She was alone again. But the silence that filled the cabin was different now. It was not a heavy, oppressive silence thick with regret. It was a clean silence, a peaceful silence. The wind still whispered through the walls, but it no longer sounded mournful. It sounded like a sigh of release. That evening, as the sun set, Elspeth did not open her ledger. Instead, she took the small calfskin-bound book, the repository of her life's accounts, and walked outside. She built a small fire. She watched the flames catch their light dancing in the deepening twilight. One by one, she tore the pages from the ledger and fed them to the fire. Pages of kindness and cruelty, of gratitude and shame. She watched the ink curl and vanish, the words turning to smoke and rising into the great dark open sky. Finally, she tossed the leather cover onto the embers. The accounts were settled. The book was closed. And under the vast silent gaze of the stars, Elspeth Finch, a woman of the prairie, was finally completely free.